Alright guys, so in this video we're going to go ahead and do an application with JavaScript and HTML using the DOM. So let's get to it. So as always, I would recommend you use Visual Studio and create a folder that is specific to your project. So in this case, I'll do open folder, go to desktop, and here I'll just create a folder. I'll call this JavaScript calculator. I'll go ahead and open it up, select the folder. Now in here I have an empty folder, and I can go ahead and add my files in here, and that way they'll all be in the same place. So I'll go ahead and create a new file. So right up here, hit that, and then I'll call this index.html. And I'll hit enter, and that'll generate my index file. Now in here, we're going to generate some boilerplate HTML. So I'll do HTML, and that'll automatically give me these options. I'll go ahead and select HTML5, and it'll give me my boilerplate. Now, finally, we're going to go ahead and add our JavaScript in here. So we'll do script, close the tag out, and inside of the opening tag in here, let me zoom in a little bit so you guys can see a little bit better. There we go. In here, I'll go ahead and add src, and I'll add my app.js. So in here, what I want to go ahead and do is create another folder, and I'll call this scripts. So any scripts that you might want to have for your JavaScript are going to go in here, okay? So inside of this folder, I'll go ahead and create an app.js, and that's going to be my main JavaScript application. Now going back to the HTML file, in here we'll do // and you'll see I have access to my scripts folder. And inside of the scripts folder, since we only have a single file, we'll select the app.js. I'll go ahead and save this out. Now I'll go back to the app.js file, and I'll do an alert just to make sure that everything is connected accordingly. So I'll say hello. Save this out. I'll use my live server. Add true and true. My page goes ahead and loads, and it says hello. So my JavaScript and my HTML are now connected. All right. So I'll get rid of the alert for right now. And right now we will focus on just the HTML. Okay. So the first thing I want to go ahead and do is change the document, well, the title from document to calculator. All right. So now we'll go inside of the body. Now, I'll take things slowly in this point since a lot of you have not taken HTML before this. So what I'll do in here is I'll create a header class, and I'll do h1, and I'll create one header here and say su calculator. All right. So in here, I'll create another header, but this time it'll be a smaller one, so we'll do h3 tag. And here we'll call this first value. Underneath this guy, we'll create an input tag, and that is where the user will be able to give us the number. So I'll say input. And then the type here, I want to change this to number. Okay. Now, additionally, I want to add an ID for this input. So I can say ID equals, and then we'll call just value 1. So everything lowercase and then 1. Now what I'll do here as well, we'll do another h3 tag, and I'll say second value. And underneath this guy, we'll do another input tag. Now, a shortcut that you can use in Visual Studio is by typing the name of the tag. So in this case, if we want an input tag, we can do input. While, for example, in this case, if we want to add an ID to it, we can do hashtag, then the name of the ID. So we'll do value 2. And you see it generates the input tag with the type and the ID, right? So it saves us a little bit of writing. So in here, we'll say number as well. Now let's just go ahead and see how this is looking. Obviously, it's not going to be anything too fancy. So we have SU calculator, first value, second value, right? Okay. So now we're going to add some buttons in here. So we'll do, let's say, button. And then we'll do the same thing. Since we want to add an ID to this, we'll do hashtag. And then we'll call this btn add, like so. So we'll have button ID btn add, and in here we'll just add a plus symbol. All right. Then we'll create another button. So button hashtag, and then we'll say btn sub for subtraction. All right. And then we'll do a minus symbol in here. And finally, underneath this part, we'll do an h1 tag as well. And then this, we're going to add an ID, and the ID is going to be result. All right. So that is it for our HTML body. Obviously, again, very simple. And right now, you'll notice that we do not have a result being displayed down here. And that's because our h1 file, or I'm sorry, our h1 tag is empty. We can go ahead and add something in here, so we can just say 0. And then, so we have something to show, right? All right. So now let's get with the JavaScript, okay? So what I'll do now is head over to my app.js and remember these IDs, right? Because we're going to be referring to them, all right? So the first thing I want to go ahead and do is create a constant. So I'll say const, and then we'll say value1 equals to document dot, and then we'll use the get element by ID option. So in this case, you see we could get it by class name, we could get it by the actual name of the tag, by tag name, or we could do other versions of this. But again, right now, the easiest one to work with is getting the element by ID, because by definition, there can only be one element with an ID. So IDs are specific to elements, okay? And in here, let's go ahead and call value1. The exact same way that you wrote value1 over in your index is how you need to write it in here. Otherwise, it will not work, okay? So I'll go ahead and copy this over for value2. Now I'll change this to 2, and I'll change this one to a 2 as well. Let's go ahead and do the result. So we'll do constant. You know what? I'll just paste the entire thing again, and then just change this to results, and this to result. Again, making sure that I am using the exact notation. Be mindful that these values over here, the values of the variables, are for internal use in JavaScript. These ones are coming straight from HTML. All right. So now we'll do the one for the buttons. So we'll do btn. I'm sorry. So constant. And then in this case, I'll just call it btn add equals document dot get element by its ID. And again, we'll go ahead and pass in btn add just to make sure. Yep. Now we'll do the same thing for the subtraction button. So I'll copy this over again, bring it back down. Instead of add in here is going to be sub. I cannot spell today. Sub. And then same thing in here, we'll call this sub. And again, just making sure it is the exact same. All right. So I'll go ahead and save this. Right now, our page, it has this, but nothing is happening just yet. Okay. So now we need to actually think of the logic as to how this is going to work, right? So one thing that we can test out is, for example, we need obviously a function to get the value, and I'm sorry about that. They get the value that is being passed over from the user to us, correct? Now, all we need to do is think of how we're going to do that. So once the user writes something in here, we need to grab that value out, right? But honestly, you don't need to worry too much about in terms of like the exact moment something happens in here. Right now, let's do this a little bit in an inefficient manner. So we'll do 2 functions for each one of our buttons in here, okay? So we'll say btn sub dot, and then we're gonna add what's called an event listener. So we'll do add. You'll see we have event listener. We're gonna go ahead and open up parentheses. Now in here, Visual Studio gives you a good amount of help in terms of what you can do. So for example, the type of event or key of HTML mapped event, and then the listener. So in this case, all this really is referring to is what event you're looking for, either be it a click, a hover, whatever event you're looking for, you're going to put it in here. And then the listener is what is going to be called once that gets affected, right? So in here, we're going to do single quotes. And you'll see in here, I have a list of quote unquote events. In this case, I want a click event. So whenever the user clicks my sub button, let me just change that to add. So it's, in order, and it doesn't really matter all that much. So whenever the user clicks my add button, something is going to happen. So in here, I can go ahead and create a function and then, work it out. But since this is what's the word I'm looking for? The listener, it needs to be, there, let me go back to it real quick. It needs to be in this format, okay? So you see it has an arrow function. So I could do an arrow function in here, or I can do an external function and then just have that placed in here, all right? So in this case, what I'm going to go ahead and do is create an external function. So let me just come down here, say function. Then we'll call this math, do math. Oh, I said we were going to do it in the simple manner, so we'll do it in the simple manner. So in here, we'll just say function, and we'll say sub, open up parentheses, open up brackets. Now in here, we're assuming that, well, we're not assuming, this is always going to be called over whenever the user actually does a subtraction, right? Now, be mindful that since this is a listener, you don't need to pass in the parentheses for this to work. You only need to pass in the name, okay? So in here, we can just, start doing some values, right? So first of all, let's do value 1. And let's see what value 1 entails, right? So I'm going to cut this out and put it inside a console.log and put that in there, all right? So I'll save this out for right now. Let's go back over to our HTML. I'll go ahead and open up our inspector, go into the console, right? So in here, I'll pass in a 12, and then I'll hit the plus button, right? Now I am, so I am messing up, so this needs to be called add. And honestly, it would have worked just as fine, just, since we're doing the add button, so that way things don't get confusing. And my mistake, and I'm sorry about that. So back here, with this 12 here, if I hit the plus symbol, you see I get back the input ID value. So I am getting back this ID, right? So I am getting back the entire input. If I expand this, somewhere around here in these properties, I will be able to find this number 12, right? So in here, if I start scrolling around for it, I should be able to find a property called value. And that is what I want to call over. So true and true, I have value right here. So now over in my JavaScript, if I were to change this to value.1.value, save this, you come back here, refresh. Let's just change that to 16, and then I hit plus symbol. Now I get a 16 back, okay? So now we can safely assume that if I do the exact same thing for value 2, obviously we're going to get something back, right? So if I get 16, and then I get an empty string back, all right? So now we can actually go ahead and start working with this in terms of math, right? So now that we have a way to get these things back over, we need to add them over to our result property, right? Because the result right now as it stands is just an empty container that we're going to put in whatever we get from these guys. So here's what I'll do. I'll grab this guy, get rid of this. Now we can simply just, say result dot, So in this case, we want to place the result of our addition inside of the inner text of our container. So we're going to say result.inner. And you could do HTML, but I would recommend text since that is the more appropriate thing that we're doing in this case. And then equals. Now, just by logic, if I do this, let me change that to a 2. We are not going to get what we're expecting. Because as it stands right now, these guys are still strings. So let's do, let's do 10, and let's do 5, right? I hit plus, I get 105. Now again, it's because these guys are strings by default, and that is outputting a string, again, by default. So if we wanted to do this mathematically speaking, what I would need to do is parse these values as integers or doubles or whatever. So I'm going to cut this out and then say parse. In this case, I'm going to use the parse float. Open up parentheses and pass that in there. I'll do the same thing for value 2, so I'll cut value 2 out and call parse float and pass that value in. Now, thing to note is floats are values that can be either full values or decimal values, right? So since we don't know what type of operations the user wants to do in terms of do they want 10.5 or something like that, it's better just to add these as floats, and that way you're covering both either full numbers, be it integers, or decimal values being doubles or floats in this case, okay? So if we come back here again, let's refresh the page. Now let's do 10 and 5 again, then we get now our 15. Okay? So that is basically it in terms of the logic, right? So as you can see, now things are working appropriately, correct? So all I would need to do now is copy this, paste it down below, and change this to sub, right? Now in here, instead of an addition, I'll do a subtraction. Then I'll copy this over as well and change this add to sub, as well as this part here. So now this one is listening for a click on my addition button. This one is listening for a click on my subtraction button. And when that happens, this one calls in the subtract function, and this one calls over the add function, right? So now we come over here. 10, that gives me 15. If I press this one. Oh, and there we go. Did I save it? No, I did not. There we go. We get a 15. Now I click it and we get a 5. Right? So, in and of itself, guys, that is it in terms of what it entails working with your DOM objects, right? So as you can see, there's not really a whole lot to worry about it. Honestly, as long as you're looking at the correct values, everything should flow smoothly, okay? So you can try and do a more, efficient code in here. So instead of having this guy like so, instead of having two functions that for the most part do more or less the same, you could go ahead and simplify this. So you could do, you could try and check for different values, right? So you could try and see if you had an event in here, meaning that if the user did something, then you pass over that event over, right? So, and say we could let's try and do that, okay? So, call this do math. Just, and do math is going to take in a value. So we can just say operator. So the operator is going to be passed in here, and that is going to be what we're going to check, right? So let me just get rid of this part here. Obviously, now these guys need to change just a little bit in order for them to work. So we'll need to do the arrow function. So equals arrow function. And then we'll pass in an event here. So we'll just call our event E. Then in here, we're going to go ahead and call in our do math and pass in our event. Now that we have our event over here, let's go ahead and see what that event has for us, right? So we'll do console.log, and then we'll do operator. All right, so let's go ahead and check it out. Uncut reference sub is not defined. Let me just get rid of that real quick. Let's get rid of you. Reload, and where am I calling sub again? Didn't save it. All right, there we go. So now if I hit the plus symbol, we get the click event, which is basically what we are passing over. Now in here, we need to, check to see what we have, right? So in this case, we have the target, which is the ID button. And then the target should have a value as well. So in this case, the value is empty, but the text content has something that we want. Or for example, the outer text as well. So you could use either of these properties to identify what is being passed over, right? So we need to remember, we need to navigate into target, and from target, we need to find either outer text or simply text content, right? All right, let's try and do that. So in here, we'll do, man, and I forgot. So targets, and then dot, let's try and do outer text. Just to make sure we're doing it right. That's just one T. I cannot spell. Outer text. So let's save it out, and let's just see what happens, right? So I hit this again, and now we get the operator. So the symbol that we pressed. So now with this, we can actually do either an if-else or a switch case to see which operation we would want to do. So in this case, let me just cut this out, and we'll do, we'll do an if, just so it's a little bit more familiar for you guys. So in here, let me just open this up, paste that in there. Let me copy this over. And then put this in here. And say if this is equal to this, and I want this. Else if is equal to, or is it minus? Then we just want to go ahead and do something else. So I'll just grab this again and change it to minus. Like so. Okay. Now we still need to have the event listener for the other one. So we'll copy it over again. And here we'll just change this to sub. Now if we come back over here, I hit that, we get 15. I hit that, we get 5. So as you can see, honestly, it might not seem like we actually saved a whole lot of code, but it is a more efficient way to do something, right? Because now you have one function that both validates the operation and takes care of it. Now, obviously, there are better ways to doing this even further, but we'll look at those as we advance throughout the course, okay? We could also add instead of getting the element by, we could do by select by class name or select query selector. And actually, the query selector would be the best way to actually do all of these, because that way you don't need to have multiple event listeners. But again, we'll look at those as the time needs. But for right now, hopefully this is useful for you guys. What I want you to try and go ahead and do by yourselves is, add the rest of the operations, so times and division, and try and see if you can make it work. All right? So I'll see you later.